Right, hello everyone. Welcome to another live streaming session. My name is James Ritson. I'm the product expert for Affinity Photo, and boy, did I forget how long that, well, I call it my intermission graphic. Did I forget how long that video was? Just sitting there waiting for it to end. Okay, so basically, this is a kind of like informal, laid-back live stream. I'm going to just basically edit some images. So if you're familiar with at least my voice, you'll know that I do the video tutorials for Affinity Photo. I do the demos and so on. And, you know, the tutorials are very much kind of matter of fact. You know, it's from A to B to C, and this is how you do whatever I'm showing you to do in the least possible time, you know. So it's very kind of... the delivery is very dry and matter of fact. So this is a chance to kind of ease up a little bit, and I've just handpicked a sample of images. I'm just basically going to edit them. Now, I haven't planned these out beforehand. I've got a rough idea of what I might do with all of them, but I'm completely open to change. So let's start with a wildlife photo I took a couple of years ago. Like, I've got some rough ideas of what I want to do with this, but again, we'll see. So first of all, this is a little bit of a controversial thing. I don't really do a lot at the actual raw development stage. You know, I make my images as sort of tonally flat as possible without going too far, really. The idea is to kind of make them more malleable, because I do a lot of my work non-destructively with layers in the main photo persona. So for example, with this image, I might move the black point slightly, but I don't even need to recover any highlight detail. I don't need to push any shadow detail, really. Nothing's clipping here. So this is pretty much good to go. I'll just check that, yep, there's no lens correction here for this particular lens, because you'll notice here on the metadata, this is a Sigma 150 to 600, but I'm using it with the Sigma MC11 adapter on a Sony body, so it's a Canon EF fit lens. But what I might be able to do is just go into my lens profiles here and search for Sigma 150 to 600. It's the contemporary model, there we go. So we'll just click this, see if it does. Yeah, okay, there's a little bit of correction there. Not a great deal. And to be quite honest with you, I mean, yeah, you can see there's a little bit of vignetting in the corner there. So technically we do need the lens correction profile, but I'm not really that fussed. You know, the curvature there isn't really enough to distract me, technically. So I'm actually going to choose not to apply that and click develop. So, sorry, just to clarify, the reason it didn't pick up that lens correction automatically is because the lens string here includes the MC11 adapter, so Affinity Photo didn't fuzzy match that, basically, because it's also got the pipe there as well. Okay, I'll just have a look at the questions. Oh, thank you, known as. Beta, new beta on the way, Beatrice. No. I get asked this reasonably frequently, actually. The reason I prefer to use the beta is because, obviously, within Serif, I do a lot of demoing to various companies and businesses and so on. And for that, I use the main release build down here. But we have a little thing where you can reset everything to factory default, and so I always do that. Whereas, you know, if I prefer to keep my own settings, I use the beta because that uses a different settings folder. So, you know, I make a lot of my own macros. I work with procedural textures. I have my workspace, how I like it, and that sort of thing. So I use the beta for that. And then when we have, invariably, when we have to come and do video tutorials, I back up my beta settings and put them aside so that I can have a factory default layout for the beta as well. But yeah, that's why I'm using the beta. So don't panic. There's no, you know, I don't have anything secret to show you or anything like that. Yeah, David, when do you crop? Right at the very end. Although sometimes I'll crop during, because it's non-destructive, but I tend to get everything down before I do my final compositional crop, because then sometimes it affects the decisions I make about, you know, tone work and so on. Anyway, let's get cracking with this image then. So first of all, I'm going to delete this background snapshot. I think I explained in my other live stream why I delete the snapshots. They increase file size, basically. Let's start with a bog standard curves adjustment. So I will use Command M to add myself a curves adjustment, and I'll just pull the details down here and just add a couple of nodes here, just to add in a bit more initial contrast, like so. Okay, and now what I think I'll do, which is actually, it's very rare for me actually to kind of plan ahead of time and do all this prep work, but I think I'll make separate foreground and background masks, or rather spare channels, because I'm thinking really I want some kind of differentiation here between the background and the foreground tones. So what I'll do is use W twice for the selection brush tool, start making a rough selection. Q for quick mask just helps me visualize more clearly what's currently in my selection. We've got that lemur at the back there. Okay, and once I've got a rough selection, I can come out of quick mask mode using Q again, and then go to refine on the context toolbar here. So let's just make a slightly bigger brush, and let's see, I think I've got some detail here that I can just drag across to matte. So I'm not actually trying to do a cutout here. So, you might argue, well, why do you need to refine it? But all the same, I just prefer to have a more accurate selection to base my masking off. Okay, yeah, I think this will do. Might just have some hairs here that I can matte. Yeah, okay, good. So now I'll just put this out as a selection, just click apply here. And then down here on the channels panel, scroll to the very bottom, I've got my pixel selection, so I'll right click that, create a spare channel, and I'll name this foreground. And then I'll just invert my selection. I prefer to work as quickly as possible, so I use a lot of keyboard shortcuts. That's Shift Command I. So now I've got the background selected, create a spare channel from that. Name that background. Okay. So far, so good. Liz, why do I use W twice? It's because we have various tool groups that are on the same shortcut keys. So when you start a new session of Affinity Photo, or any of the apps actually, it will default to one tool. So in this case, when I use W from starting a new session, it switches over to the flood select tool. And then I just need to use W again, and it toggles over to the selection brush tool. This, just so it doesn't catch you out, within the same session, it will actually go back to the tool that you just had selected. So for example, if I switch across to, I don't know, the pen tool using P, and then I go back to W, it will go back to the selection brush tool, not the flood select, because that's what I previously had selected, if that makes sense. Okay. Now I'm going to do something else, which again I don't usually do, but I'd like to show you because I'm all about being open-minded, trying out new workflow techniques, trying out new approaches and layer structures, that type of thing. So whereas before I'd be a little bit lazy with my organization and probably just mask everything separately, I'm actually going to try using groups. So I'm going to create a group here for my foreground. We'll call that FG. Excuse me, and my background. Okay, and then I will add masks into both of these. So let's add a mask into the background group here. And with the mask selected, I will right click background and load it to the mask alpha. Now you'll notice that where my lemur's gone, it disappeared. Don't worry, that's because currently this group is just passing through the mask. There's nothing in that group to actually suggest that we want to mask anything else at the moment. So that's fine. We'll do the same for foreground. So we'll add a mask, then load in that foreground channel. Okay, so now pretty much all of our entire image has disappeared. To rectify this, let's get a curves adjustment, drop it into the background group. So we just offer it to the label here, like so. Then our lemurs have appeared. And we'll do the same for foreground. So let's add a curves adjustment, drop it into the foreground. There we go. So now, effectively, we're telling Affinity Photo, no, we don't just want to pass through the mask. We want to actually mask these curves adjustment layers. Okay. I'll just I'll just see if there's a few things I can address here. So Jean-Pierre, interesting to see that you don't use more of the raw engine. Does it mean it's not priority for Serif or just your own workflow? I can't speak for Serif. I do know that, until we eventually bring out some kind of asset management application, that, the raw development, it has seen a few improvements over the various versions. But it's kind of like, it's a means to an end. It's a starting point. That's not to say that we kind of neglect the overall quality of it. In fact, from 1.7 upwards, the demosaicing and the noise reduction received vast improvements. But, it's not like, you see stories of people trying to open up 10 raw files all at once and they all open up in separate tabs and stuff. That's not really what Affinity Photo is meant for. We don't have like a camera raw module or anything like that. And that's kind of been my approach as well, is that, for my workflows, I don't need to batch develop loads of different raw files all at once. I work singularly on individual images. And if you approach it from that mindset, then it's absolutely great. I'll just see if there's anything else. Oh boy, Chanel. Channels are different, and in Photoshop, can you briefly explain Affinity channels? I might have to shelve that for another day, I'm afraid, because that's a whole other it's a whole other topic on its own. I might try and slip some channel work in there. I'll see what I can do. Hi, David. And hi, David. Two Davids. Okay, so where were we? Yes, the background and foreground masks. So, for example, now that this is masked to the foreground, I'll go into my curves here. And I don't know if I want to do too much to this. Perhaps just, increase the contrast slightly. And the background, I'll definitely do a bit more with. So let's get the curves adjustment here and drag this down. So I want to darken the background and, make the lemurs pop out in the foreground a bit more. Let's see. Colors, I think. Color saturation, yeah. So in the background group, I've already got the curves adjustment selected. So if I add, say, an HSL adjustment using Command U, that automatically child layers into the background group. So that's fine. That's what we want. Let's drag the saturation down slightly. I don't know if you can see that very well on screen share, but here's the before and the after. So we're just kind of knocking a little bit of the intensity off those background tones. And now in the foreground group here, I might do the same. I might add an HSL shift adjustment, go over to the reds, bring those up slightly. Perhaps also bring the luminosity up. So we're brightening the red tones on the lemurs here. And we'll increase the saturation slightly as well. Then do the same for yellows. Just bring luminosity shift up and saturation up. Okay. So far, so good. I think I'll collapse these groups for a minute. And above everything else, I might add a selective color adjustment. Now, I'm going to use Option S for this because I create various custom shortcuts for myself based on things that I do frequently. Ordinarily, you could go to Layer and New Adjustment Layer to get to that adjustment, but you'll see here I've put it on a shortcut along with a few other adjustments as well. Okay, so let's see. Selective color, I will experiment with this. Nope, that looks terrible. Okay, so let's bring yellow up, cyan down. Let me see, and maybe yellows. Interesting. Okay, so we're producing an almost sort of duotone saturated look to this. But I think what I'll do instead actually is drag that selective color adjustment into the background group, then get back into it and tweak these tones a bit more. Because I like what it's doing to the background, but not the lemurs in the foreground. So let's leave that as it is, I think, for now. We'll have a look at that. So that's really interesting. It's almost like a film emulation process, like two-strip. Reminds me of a two-strip film stock process macro I made a while back. Okay, foreground. Let's try selective color in the foreground here. And let's see. Bring the yellows up down slightly, cyan down. There we go. We're getting that nice red, orangey red in the eyes there and on the fur. And across on yellows, I might just leave them as they are, actually. Yeah. Okay. So sometimes, it's a good idea just to take stock of what you've done so far, just to see, what you started with and what you've ended up with. So that's a really interesting, dramatic transformation. I suppose I like it. One of the benefits of working with non-destructive layers is that you can save the document, come back in at a later date, with a fresh perspective, and you might find yourself wondering, what the heck did I do that for? Or, you might come back later on and think, yeah, actually, that looks quite nice. Okay, so let's see. Let's collapse these again. I'll do some noise reduction and sharpening. So again, rather than part of the initial raw development process, I like to do this non-destructively using live filter layers in the main photo persona. So here, for example, I will add an unsharp mask. Okay, let's just zoom in so we can see the effect we're having. I'll set radius to 2 and factor to 2. There we go. That's quite aggressive at the moment. Not sure if I'll keep that. But now also notice that we're exacerbating the noise in the background. So this was shot at, I want to say, ISO 800. Let me just check that so I'm not lying to you. Oh, ISO 1600. Interesting. Yeah, okay. So that does make sense for the noise to be brought out like that. So then on the channels panel, I will get the unsharp mask and load the foreground channel into the unsharp mask alpha. So now we're avoiding over sharpening the background, which is already quite noisy. And we're just isolating it to the lemurs instead, which is great because now what I can do is quite separately add a denoise live filter, bring that up until that luminance noise disappears, like so, and then load it into the load the background channel I made into the denoise mask. So now it's only affecting the background and not the lemur. Lemurs, sorry, plural. Okay. I'll just preempt a question that might come up. Why do you bother denoising the background? It's for compression efficiency. Now, this can introduce banding if you're not careful, especially at higher ISOs, but that is why we work in 16-bit precision as opposed to 8-bit. You can reduce the, the risk of things like banding and other artifacting. So I do this for compression efficiency, basically. If you think about it, the more high frequency detail you have in your image, like this, for example, the harder it's going to be to compress to something like JPEG. So I do all my compression using MozJPEG for my website and so on. I actually export out of Affinity Photo as TIFF files. So lossless files, so the whole compression angle doesn't really apply there, but it still does when you then have to encode it to JPEG with, chroma subsampling and quantization and everything else. So I like to make my files as easy to compress as possible, which means you can squeeze more quality out of them at the same relative file size. Okay. I think this is almost done, basically. I think I'll just crop this. So C for the crop tool, and I'm going to go for a really nice tight crop of the lemurs, like so. Let's try that. Kind of, I want this guy sort of head on. I say guy, I'm just assuming it's a male. Yeah, that looks nice. So before I do anything else to this and potentially take it too far or ruin it, which has been known to happen, I will save it. Let's save it as, create a new folder in my live folder called edited. Okay. And I'll take a look at that, after the live stream, and I'll probably post up a few of these on Twitter and Instagram and so on. Okay. So that's me, relatively happy with that. Like I say, unless you're on a deadline, obviously, it was a bit different if you're working professionally, don't feel compelled that you absolutely have to finish an edit right there and then. You can always come back to it. You might have some new ideas, you might have some new techniques. Now, let's see. Yeah, I think I'll tackle this one next because it brings about an interesting discussion about color spaces and also color management. And I've got a little bee in my bonnet about color management, which I will address. So, oh, David, have you used Unsharp Mask Live Filter with Luminosity Blend Mode? Yeah, I have in the past. I guess the thing is, like, especially because I have to kind of, it's my job basically to learn as much as I can about different workflows, different processes, and so on. I kind of flip between different ideas and different workflows all the time. So, what I'm demonstrating to you today might not be the same. It might not be the approach I would take in, I don't know, 2 or 3 months' time once I've, I've been working on different things and so on. I have tried it in the past. At the moment, I'm all about the kind of, masking the foreground and background and denoising and sharpening them separately so that I avoid any kind of sharpening whatsoever on the background information. Now, let's see. So for this image, you notice on the histogram, we've got all of these red tones clipping here. Okay, and this brings about a discussion about wide gamut color profiles and so on. Okay, so we work in sRGB by default. Okay, and we can use wider profiles like Adobe RGB, or in my case, I'm going to use ROM RGB, which is essentially Pro Photo. So if you're wondering, why Affinity Photo doesn't ship with Pro Photo, that's because it's just there under a different name. It's ROM RGB. Okay, now notice that my histogram has shifted as well. I debated about whether to put this in because it's kind of pointless doing this on a live stream where the final color primaries are Rec 709, which is very similar to sRGB. So, I might be able to see all of these lovely, intense, rich color tones on my monitor. I think it has like 95% P3 coverage, but it won't translate to YouTube very well. All the same, though, I wanted to kind of take you through what I would do for this type of workflow anyway, even if you can't see the really intense tones. Okay, so this gives me a little bit more latitude, gives me a bit more headroom, for those red, especially those intense red tones, so I'm not clipping them. I'll just drag the highlights back ever so slightly, but not really by too much, again. Like I say, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but in my previous live stream, I went on about, the idea of like compressing all the tones, pushing shadows to the max, dragging highlights all the way down, and it just doesn't work. You just end up with something that looks like it was created with pastels, and it's really hard to work the tones that way. You want to kind of maintain some natural contrast to the scene. So I might just bring the black point up ever so slightly, but not by too much. I mean, we're not clipping any tones down there anyway, so that's fine. Okay, and then I'll quick develop, move to the photo persona. So I will start with a curves adjustment, as always. I will set, well, before I do that, I'll just drag this down and create some more contrast here. Then I'll set the blend mode to luminosity. Okay, so now if I just undo that, so you can see that before, that's just normal, so we're affecting the RGB channel data cumulatively, and then the after, you'll see the intensity dies down a little bit because we're only affecting the perceived brightness or the luminosity of the image. And this just gives me a little bit more headroom to, make the highlight tones here slightly more dramatic without pushing the color detail too far. So, at the moment at least, I like to have separate control over the color detail. So then I might add an HSL adjustment, go across to the reds. Let's see, take the saturation up. So again, I'll just see what this appears like in OBS. Oh, okay, yeah, that does look quite intense on OBS as well. That's being color managed to Rec 709. So hopefully this will come across reasonably well on the live stream as well. Here's hoping. Those really rich red tones, they're practically popping off the monitor here. It's like making my eyes bleed, Let's see, let's take that up slightly further. Let's bring the yellow luminosity up. Now, I quite like this. So I love color in my images, but sometimes I love the kind of separation you get when you boost the luminosity of a specific color range like that. But, I think I'll bring the colors up anyway. So this is looking really dramatic now. I'm quite liking this. So in the name of drama, why don't we take this further? I will add a selective color adjustment. Let's go across to reds. And as soon as I start to take cyan down, that's going to go, well, probably too intense now, to be honest. But that's okay, because we can dial it back. I'm just playing around at the moment, getting some nice starting points and ideas. So let's take that down. Yeah, okay. Wow. That's quite vibrant. If we compare it to the before and the after, that's quite a difference. Let's see. I'm going to use a color balance adjustment, I think. I don't really use color balance very frequently, but sometimes it is useful to separate the tonal regions and maybe just add a little bit of a bias in there, or rather use it to kind of neutralize a certain bias. So if this is a bit, red and orange heavy, for example, then we could maybe do this in the shadow region here to, just take a little bit of red out of the whole scene here. Let's see, midtones. Yeah, let's do the same here. Okay. Just looking at this, I think it needs even more drama, because why not? Now, I have an interesting little behavioral thing to show you. So I like to use live filters wherever possible, because it's non-destructive, and also it cuts down on things like, duplicating pixel layers and therefore bloating the file size of your document. However, there are some very rare occasions where I will duplicate image pixel layers, like the background layer here, and one of those is clarity. So when we use live clarity, we can drag the strength up and we get some nice application there. Okay, but because this has to render real time, it has to composite in real time whilst the user is, zipping around doing different things and, perhaps adjusting layers on top of that or underneath it, and everything's getting redrawn in the layer stack all the time. It's slightly more conservative than the destructive version. So if I delete that and instead duplicate the background pixel layer, then add a clarity, destructive filter, we get some more, the structural effect is a little bit more pronounced. Perhaps not as much as I expected it to be, that said. So that goes in favor of the live version. But still, it just lets you be a little bit more aggressive with the clarity effect. And then what I can do is option click on the mask layer here to add an empty mask. B for the paintbrush tool, and then I'll just switch across to white and just paint in where I want that clarity filter or the structural enhancement to apply. Okay, there's the before and the after. So again, we've done something fairly dramatic with this. Here's our starting point and here's the end point. Looking at this, maybe I have gone too far. So what I could do, for example, is jump back into the HSL shift adjustment and maybe just take the tones down ever so slightly, maybe not by too much. But there we go. That's really something quite dramatic. So once again, I'll get rid of the background snapshot and save that. Okay. Now, before I move on, I will just explain something about color profiles, display, color management, and that sort of thing. So the reason, well, how do I explain this? Basically, I see a lot of this. People go into preferences, okay, and they go to color, and then they'll calibrate their monitor. They'll calibrate and profile their display. Okay, so they will, they'll use i1 Profiler, or they might use open source software like DisplayCal. That's what I use, which uses the Argyle CMS backend. Okay, but then what they'll do is they'll set up the RGB color profile, or well, all of them, to use that display profile, and it's like, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. Okay, so the idea is that when you have these display profiles, especially the the bespoke ones created for your particular display, the idea is that that's set at the OS level. So, for example, in Mac OS, you go to Displays and you go to the Color tab. Okay, oh, let me just bring that up. So this is my monitor, the XV273K here. It's using my profile from 2020. Gosh, that's quite old now. I should probably reprofile that at some point. And then I've got my capture card here, which is, it has its own profile, which is basically Rec 709 primaries, okay? And what macOS is, doing is it's color managing based on those two profiles. And so Affinity Photo follows that lead. So what it does is it takes that ROM RGB device profile, as we've referred to it, and then it translates the color values based on your display profile so that what you're seeing on your canvas or your document view is correct for your monitor. Okay, if I go, assigning or converting to the display profile here, so if my document is using the display profile, that completely knocks out, it completely negates the whole point of color management. The whole point of color management is to go from a known standardized device profile like sRGB or ROM RGB or Adobe RGB or ProPhoto, whatever you want to use, to your bespoke or factory default display profile. That is how it's supposed to work. So please do not set your display profile in here. Either use the defaults and then tweak manually when you need to, or if you always want to work in Adobe RGB, then you can set that as a default here. But do not use the display profile. That's completely wrong. Okay. Gosh, that is a lot of questions. Let me just, before we move on, I'll just have a quick scan. Oh, thank you for the compliment. Extremely pleasant. That's great. Can I quote that? Extremely pleasant. Yeah, David, is there any difference? You know what? I'm not actually sure. I would need to experiment. I'd imagine there would be. The calculations, the mathematical calculations might differ, because I'm not sure when you convert to lab, I'm not sure how lightness is calculated. It should be based off the weighted RGB. But because of the D50 illuminant profile for lab, I'm not sure whether those calculations might be different compared to RGB, which typically is sRGB D65. So there might be a bit of a difference there. Let's see. I'd like to find out more about calibrating my monitor. Yeah, that's probably a topic for another day. But basically, calibration is like 90% of the job, and then profiling is 10%. So, well, that's the way it should be anyway. So, ideally your monitor should have physical controls to control things like the red, green, and blue contribution, brightness, contrast, that sort of thing. Obviously built-in laptop panels or iMacs, stuff, things like that, Surface Studio. You're a bit more limited in what you can do. You can't have individual RGB controls. So the actual profile needs to do a bit more work there, which is subject to things like precision and rounding errors. So it's not ideal. But yeah, basically you calibrate your monitor to a known standard. So for example, for my office, which is fairly dimly lit most of the time, both during the day and at night when the lights are on, I profile to 80 nits or 80 candela per square meter in terms of brightness. You want to avoid calibrating to a brightness that's not suitable for the environment you're in. Too dark and you lose detail. I actually had that happen at work. We moved upstairs where we've got these skylights in, for example. My monitor was still calibrated for 80 candela per square meter or 80 nits brightness, and I would find when I transferred photos to my iPhone that I would miss things in the shadow details. So, for example, I had some nighttime shots of London when I was last down there, and there were some dust spots in some very dark areas. I completely missed them when I was editing, and that's because I forgot to recalibrate and reprofile my monitor for a brighter environment. So actually, I think I went up to 100 nits or 100 candela per square meter, and then I actually started to see that crucial detail in the very dark tones. But the problem is that if you calibrate so that your monitor is too bright, not only does it give you eye fatigue, but it's also perceptually wrong. So then you end up making things, you end up, you know, let's say you post your images and you look at them on your phone or a tablet or someone else's computer and you wonder, why are they too dark? Or, you know, you print things out and the brightness of the print does not match even remotely what you're seeing on your screen. So getting the brightness right for your environment is really, really important. Probably more so than color accuracy as a starting point, although it helps to have accurate colors as well. Yeah, I always profile to D65 or 6500 Kelvin for kind of like a daylight balance. I know people that, you know, for print and so on, they might choose different temperatures, but D65 is a nice kind of middle point, I feel. Anyway, God, I've done a lot of talking. Less talking, more editing, I think. Let's see. I'll tell you what. I threw this one in last minute. This is a drone photo. So we had a Mavic 2 Pro on loan from DJI a while ago in order to do a video that kind of showed, you know, drone photography, post-production, that sort of thing. So it was quite fun to fly around the Peak District and various other areas. And we've improved support for the lens distortion correction. It used to be that it would be completely, you know, beyond comprehension. It was completely warped and everything because this profile here was completely wrong. I'm not sure if that was a lens fun issue, which is the lens database we use, or whether we were doing something wrong. But that's been fixed now, so that's great. So you can see the before and the after. So that's doing its job properly. That's great. But there's a little trick that you might find interesting. And this doesn't work at all focal lengths, especially if you have a zoom lens. It tends to work at the wider end. So, for example, my Olympus and the previous Sony camera I had, at the wider end, you can actually take the scale down. And on some cameras, you can take it down to something like 95% before you actually start to see areas of alpha or canvas. Okay, so for the Mavic 2 Pro, I can take this down to 97%, and that's really nice. It just means I get a few, you know, extra pixels around the border of my image, and I'm all about that, so that's great. Shadows and highlights, let's just bring these highlights in slightly. Okay, and I think that will do. Like I say, I don't do a lot in RAW, you know, the actual RAW development process, so let's click develop. And let's see what we might do with this. So, first of all, I'll tell you what, no, I'll dehaze. I think I'll dehaze the image. So, to do this non-destructively, unfortunately, we don't have it as a live filter layer. So I'm going to duplicate my background pixel layer, run the Haze Removal filter here. Okay, and then I can pretty much just leave it at the defaults. Just click apply. And then I've got, you know, I can compare the before and the after. So that's interesting. Maybe I'll take the opacity of this down, actually, maybe to around 50%. Because I felt like maybe the colors were getting slightly too saturated. And I kind of like having a little bit of haze in there. I find it more atmospheric. So I'll take it down to about 50%. Now, the next thing I will do, though, is I will in-paint myself out of this photo non-destructively. So there I am with my little red anorak on and my jeans. So I'll add a new pixel layer, Command-Shift-N. Then I'll get the in-painting brush tool from the tools panel here, set my sampler to current layer and below. So what this is going to enable me to do is in-paint, like so, but it's actually going to, it's sampling from the layers underneath the current pixel layer, but it's putting the result on the pixel layer. So for whatever reason, you know, later on, if we're not satisfied with the in-painting or the retouching result, we're not committed to it. You know, it's just a layer that's being composited on top of the original image information. So, you know, like I say, in that instance, I probably didn't need to do it, but it's just so ingrained now as a habit that I always do retouching indestructively on new pixel layers. Okay, let's use a good old curves adjustment. And we will just add a little bit more contrast into this scene. Okay. What next, he says? I will try maybe an HSL adjustment again. Let's go in with the reds here and increase the saturation and then perhaps the luminosity. So I must say, traditionally, I'm pleasantly surprised, actually. I did struggle, I'll be honest, with the RAW files from the Mavic 2 Pro and the JPEG files, to be honest. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a miracle piece of tech. Obviously, it's been surpassed now, it's like 3 or 4 years later now. But, for a 1-inch sensor, the results are quite good most of the time. I did struggle with dynamic range a little bit, though. Kind of had that sort of crushed digital look going on, found I really couldn't work the shadow tones as much as I wanted to. Mainly because they were kind of noisy mush. But yeah, this, it's okay. It's okay. I think I'm just used to, Micro Four Thirds and full frame sensor editing where you can just push things around a little bit more, and you've got a little bit more latitude to work with. So that's an interesting little edit there. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. Maybe the reds and the eyes were a bit too sickly. Not sure yet. But I will add a selective color again. You're probably sick of seeing the selective color adjustment by now. I probably live and die by this adjustment. It's my go-to for, pulling color tones apart, really tweaking colors to get some interesting looks and effects. Yeah, that yellow's, oh no. Oh, excuse me. I don't like that yellow at all. So I'm going to go back in and take the saturation down slightly. There we go. That's looking slightly better. Okay. Let me think. What else might I do for this? I might use my old trick here. I'll just check the chat as well. David, does dehaze distance just do a gradient? I think it's probably something like dark channel prior calculation. So like a calculation based off the channel with, I think, the most contrast. Some kind of evaluation based around that. I'm not actually sure. That's a good question. I should ask. Yeah, the DJI Mini 2. I have not, since I did the DJI video, I've not kept up to date with drone regulations or anything like that. Because I think I had it's funny how it takes just one bad experience to kind of put you off something. We went on holiday to Gozo, which is an island just north of Malta, and I took the drone. I think I can talk about this now because it's not on loan anymore, and it's a good sort of 2.5, 3 years, so I'm probably fine to mention it. But yeah, I took it abroad. I got the insurance. I filled out everything that I needed to. I did it all. I made sure I was legally good to go. And then the controller, I figured it out in the end. The controller developed an issue with, I think, the left rudder, which moves the camera pit up and down. And for some reason, every time I used the rudder control, the drone would absolutely freak out. And it would become uncontrollable. It would start drifting. You would use the control sticks to try and fight it and bring it back. Even the return to home, it would return to home, but it was like something else was fighting against it. So it would start returning, but then it wouldn't. It would kind of start drifting away. It completely freaked me out, especially because we were on a cliff top, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, and it was starting to drift just further in that direction. I was like, no, come back. And then, it soon turned into frustration, trying to land the thing. It was doing obstacle avoidance, even though there was nothing there. And then it just freaked out again. And it was just sort of, I have this distinct recollection of it sort of being catapulted across the ground. It was still fine. There's a little chip in one of the blades. And then I worked out that basically it was that control that was doing it, moving the camera gimbal up and down. And from that point, I started to drag on my phone screen instead, because you can do a tap drag to move the camera. And then it was absolutely fine. But that left a really sour taste in my mouth, that the controller could just start suddenly malfunctioning like that. And I haven't touched a drone since. It's just not been of interest to me. Anyway, I blabbed on a bit about that. But anyway, so let me add a Gaussian blur live filter, check preserve alpha, drag the radius up, and set the blend mode to overlay. Now, this is far too strong. So this is kind of like, you know, you traditionally associate this type of thing with the Orton effect, except in Affinity Photo, you can do it non-destructively. You don't have to duplicate pixel layers just to add a Gaussian blur and that sort of thing. So you can just add a live Gaussian blur layer, set the blend mode, and then to, you know, tailor the strength to how you want, you can either use opacity, which is sort of a brute force approach, or my preference is to use blend ranges using this cog icon here. And what this enables me to do is just get the left-hand node on source layer ranges, drag that down, and now I'm blending the Gaussian blur layer out of the shadow tones, gradually blending it into the midtones, and then fully blending it into the highlight tones. And I can take this further. I can create an S-curve like so. So now what I have instead is this lovely hazy diffused glow over the brighter areas in the image. Okay, it's almost like that kind of diffusion you get from overexposing film. Maybe not quite. That's a unique look. I don't think we'll ever be able to recreate that. But that looks quite nice. And again, it might be too strong again, so let's take the opacity down, maybe to about 50%. Okay, and it does have a nice little side benefit of increasing color saturation slightly. So again, in the interest of not overworking this image, I think I will leave it there. I'll just add some sharpening. So I'll use a live unsharp mask, like so. I'm going to be lazy here because, you know, the foreground and background separation is so straightforward. I'm not going to bother masking. Instead, I will invert the unsharp mask, just Command-I, B for the paintbrush tool, then switch across to white, and just paint into the foreground areas like so. I'll just isolate my mask to make sure I haven't missed anything. That's fine. Okay, so then we just add some fine detail sharpening into the final image. Okay, and I will leave that one there before I take it any further and do something that just overcooks it far too much. Drones now do bracketing. Yes, I did experiment with the bracketing feature on the Mavic 2 Pro, but I actually found, I'm not sure if it was because it was an electronic sensor, the shutter speed and combining the aperture, I couldn't, I'd have to stop right down, you know, and then you get diffraction, and I was finding, you know, even with stopping right down and using the fastest shutter speed, the sun was just too powerful. You know, the images were just, I couldn't capture something with enough detail in the brightest areas. Maybe they've improved the bracketing now, so I don't know. But I struggled with that as well, to be honest. Let's see. I hope no lemurs got hurt. Is that in reference to the drone? I didn't fly a drone around the wildlife park, if that's what you're asking. Now that would be irresponsible. It did get attacked by seagulls, though. The obstacle avoidance kept going off, and I wondered what the heck was going on, and then I realised it was this flock of seagulls had come out of nowhere and started to attack my drone, which was interesting. Okay. Yes, so this image here, severely underexposed, so let's bring the brightness up. It's probably the most I've actually done in the developed persona. Again, we're not clipping any tones here, so I don't need to bother with shadows and highlights. I like to keep that natural contrast. And we'll click develop. Okay, so before we do anything else, I will create a new pixel layer, get the inpainting brush tool, set my sampler to current layer and below, like I just did with the previous image. Hello, brush hardness is at 100, that should be 80. Must have been doing something with that previously. Okay, and then I'm just going to brush into the out of focus rock in the foreground here, like so. Let's see what kind of result this gives us. Oh, actually, yeah, not bad. Okay, so I have a little interesting technique. If I'm trying to, I'm not too fussed about this, to be honest, because you can see here we've got some out of focus areas which have been sampled from over here, and then we've got some sharper areas which have been sampled from up here. So there's a kind of a mixture. Just to help it blend a little bit more successfully, I might use a healing brush, set the sampler again to current layer and below, and just sample from some of these areas, like so. So it's doing a nice little thing where it kind of blends in the tonal detail. Whoops, let me undo that. Let's not duplicate the baboon's bum. In actual fact, looking at this, maybe I should just go over this sharper area. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so it's not perfect, but I'll leave it like that for now. Okay, I'd love to get a drone which is the best. I cannot advise on that nowadays. I would research sensor sizes. I think, to be honest, you know, if you're going to do retouching work on, you know, your drone photographs, I would go for at least a 1-inch sensor. I don't know if they make them any bigger now, without, you know, needing specific interchangeable lens mounts or exceeding like a weight class. But yeah, I would go for maybe like a 1-inch sensor minimum. That's just my preference. So, you know, if you want to make sure that you can work the image a little bit in post. If you're shooting video, maybe there's less of a concern over that. But yeah, for stills photography, I would want a slightly bigger sensor. Okay, so yeah, this is a tricky one, because in terms of tonal separation, you know, the baboon's fur is mostly red, and then we've got this reddish sandy background going on as well. So it's really hard to kind of, you know, pull the foreground out. So what I might do instead ultimately is end up making this a black and white image. Oh, Neil, to isolate the mask, yeah, so basically, how can I show you this quickly? Well, basically, layer isolation is, you don't need to do it with a mask, you can do it with any layer. You just Option-click on Mac or Alt-click on Windows onto a layer, like that. So, for example, this has isolated that pixel layer, which is doing that in-painting brushwork, you know, over the initial background layer. And excuse me, then to come out of isolation mode, you just click onto any other layer in your layer stack, basically. Okay, so where was I? Yeah, all right. So tonally then, let's add a curves adjustment. I'm reticent to push these tones really, because it's looking a bit tricky. And I think what I may very well do is go onto my background layer, W for the selection brush tool. I'm not going to refine this actually, so if we're not going to refine or map the selection, you'll probably want to enable soft edges up here, because what that does is that when you let go of the mouse button, it will anti-alias the edge detail on the selection. Which, of course, if you're working with pixel information derived from things that are naturally unsharp, like cameras, it gives you a more natural edge to your selection, as opposed to it just being hard-edged pixel detail. We'll do the tail there as well. Okay. Yeah. So, because this is a rough selection, I want to be really careful here about exactly how far I push tones if I'm going to use this as a mask. So let's just kind of roughly isolate them. Yeah, that will do. Okay. Then at the top of my layer stack, I will add an HSL shift adjustment. But again, I've got to be really careful with this. So reds, let's do something like, you know, let's bring these up slightly, maybe increase the luminosity shift, bring the saturation up. Okay. And then what I might actually do is add another HSL shift adjustment underneath that, bring the reds down. So, you know, I'm not bothering with masking the foreground and the background here. What I'm doing is actually bringing the saturation down on the whole document, okay, specifically the reds and the yellows, and then I'm bringing the reds and the yellows back up on the baboons, like so. So Seems a bit like a rough-handed approach, but it works. I'll just show you the before and the after. You'll see we've got that little bit of sort of crucial separation going on there now. Okay, now at this point, I think I'm just going to do, I hate this term, non-destructive dodging and burning, because I find it a little bit reductive as to, what this approach actually allows you to do. It's not just dodging and burning, which most people kind of equate to, brightening or darkening areas of the image, okay? So I'm going to have a new pixel layer, overlay blend mode. I'll take the opacity down to 25, but I'm probably going to take this down further once I've got the brush work in. So I'm going to brush over this area here to brighten it, switch across to black using X on the keyboard, and then brush into the surrounding areas to darken them, okay? So this is too strong and it looks terrible. Not a problem, so I'm going to take the opacity down to maybe about 10%. So look, this is really subtle. Here it is. Here's the before and the after, but we're adding a little bit more light onto our subjects here whilst darkening the background, and it just helps kind of narrow the focus down on this image. In fact, we might even go so far as to take another pixel layer and do the same thing. Let's have a low opacity. I'm just going to darken these areas here, like so. In fact, I'll even darken around the outlines of the baboons, okay? Like so. All right. Now, at this point then, I'm thinking a black and white conversion. Okay. So this is another interesting thing that's worth exploring. So if I add a black and white adjustment, okay, we have our contribution sliders and, we can tweak them like so. Okay. But this isn't actually, if I reset these to the default sliders, this is not a natural grayscale representation. And what I mean by that is that generally when we calculate things like intensity or luminosity, we do it by calculating a weighted average of the red, green, and blue channel information. Because the way that we perceive color, we are, significantly sensitive to green wavelengths of light, and then down the pecking order, it's green, red, and then we're least sensitive to blue. So when we do like a grayscale conversion, there's like a weighted average here that takes that, how we perceive color into account. And black and white doesn't do this. Okay. Now you could play with the sliders to find a creative effect. But if you actually wanted a weighted grayscale average, the easiest way to actually do this is to add a channel mixer adjustment and set the output model here, or output channel, to gray. Okay, and that is a weighted intensity of the red, green, and blue channel information. In fact, just to demonstrate this, I will create a merged pixel layer. Let's call this CM. Turn the channel mixer off, add a black and white adjustment, make a merged pixel layer of the black and white, call that BW, okay? Then we can delete that. And now, if I turn off, or rather if I isolate the channel mixer layer, you can see the difference there. So that's with black and white, okay? And that's with the weighted grayscale average. So at the end of the day, does it really matter? Probably not, but it's worth experimenting, because as you can see here, I would have to play with the color sliders to see, if I could get some better separation going on here. The baboon's fur is almost kind of blending into the background, whereas, there's very little in it, but you could argue maybe there's slightly more separation there, or just because this image seems perceptually a little bit darker, perhaps it makes it easier to pick out the subjects relative to the background. Okay, now I'll delete these two layers, turn the channel mixer back on, and I think I will add a curves adjustment above that just to make this even moodier than it already is. Okay, that's quite, I mean, this is not my usual thing. I don't really go for this, but I suppose there's something compelling about this. It's a tricky photograph anyway, because I just didn't, you know, at that distance, even with a full frame camera, I just didn't have, you know, that foreground, and I didn't have enough separation between the foreground and background to, you know, suitably blur out the background detail and make this image a bit more compelling, or, you know, easier to kind of digest in terms of what's happening visually. That said, this is a cool little thing that I like to do. Once we've actually done our monochrome or grayscale conversion, right, we're free to actually manipulate the colors lower down in the layer stack. So we don't have to worry about, you know, whether if we intensify the reds, it will make them too garish or something like that. So for example, with this HSL shift here, which is masked to the baboons, I could increase the luminosity like so, or perhaps, you know, increase the luminosity on the yellow here, so I could bring them out a little bit more from the background here, or perhaps on my HSL shift adjustment here, I might tweak the saturation here. So these are sort of micro adjustments. Okay. But again, what I might do is just underneath the channel mixer adjustment is I might add, you know what, I was going to add an HSL, but I think I'll add Selective Color. And let's see where that gets us. So if I now start tweaking the Selective Color sliders, just bringing them all the way really, we're having some, you know, subtle but interesting effects on our grayscale conversion here. So if I turn the channel mixer adjustment off, this is what it looks like, which is obviously horrific. No one would really go for that. But once it's a grayscale conversion, you know, it works. So that's also worth experimenting with, is, you know, even if your final image is black and white, play around with color manipulation techniques lower down in the layer stack to see how it affects the black and white outcome. That's quite an interesting approach to try. So let me do a final crop on this image then. I want quite a tight crop, I think, something like this. There we go, that'll do nicely. And I'll save that out, and I think I might come back to that at a later date, see if I can get some more tonal separation going on there, because it's still kind of difficult to see what's going on. Okay, so next then, I think I think I'll cover this. So I did an evening with a photographic group recently, and one of the questions that came up in the email that I wasn't actually sure about, and so I wanted clarification on, was how to produce, I think they called them photo panels for digital projection. And so I went away, got a bit more info about this, and they were very kind. They basically told me that what they were after was some way of doing like a collage of photos into one image that, for submission for things like photography competitions and printing and that sort of thing. So I will quickly talk through how to do this in Affinity Photo, but to be quite honest, this is actually a job for Affinity Publisher, and I'll show you why. But first of all, let's do it in Affinity Photo. So within Photo, let's say we want some digital projection. Let's say we're going for some 4K high quality goodness. So we'll use the QFHD preset here under Web. That's a 4K 16:9 resolution. We'll create that. Okay. And what I want to start doing is, laying out my panels using the rectangle tool on the tools panel here. So let me just drag this out. Let's say I want a square panel, so I can hold Shift to constrain that, like so. And just so we can see where it is on our document, let's change the fill to like a mid-gray. This doesn't matter, that color is getting knocked out anyway, but it just helps us visualize, our panel layout. Okay. The other thing we might do is add a stroke. So if we wanted like a border, we might want, a 6-point border around our panel here. And then what I can do is get one of my photo documents, like for example this one, and drag it into my panel document here. Now, this is the great thing. I promise this isn't inadvertently becoming some kind of sales demo, but this is one of the main advantages of using something like Affinity Photo or Designer or Publisher, is that we have a shared code base between all three apps and also a shared common file format. Okay, and you'll see this in Publisher in a few minutes. But basically, if we have a bunch of our documents here that we've saved as AF photo files, we don't have to go in and separately export them all to TIFF or JPEG, just so that we can drop them into something, another document or a layout in Publisher. We can just drop the AF photo files in and they appear as embedded documents here. So now I can clip this to my rectangle, like so, and then scale it and reposition it within the panel, okay? Now, if I want to resize the panel, I might come across a little bit of a problem here, which is that I start to distort the image. So what we need to do here is, with the rectangle selected, enable Lock Children on the context toolbar, and that will enable you to rescale the panel. The only disadvantage to this, and again, this is why I advocate using Publisher instead, is that you then have to go in manually and reposition or rescale the embedded document, okay? So it's perfectly possible to do this type of thing in Affinity Photo if you want to. I can duplicate my rectangle here. Let's say, in fact, let's take this one and scale it up slightly, and then take this second rectangle and bring it down here. And let's say I put in an image of this dragonfly, like so, and clip it into my rectangle here. That's a perfectly valid approach. And you can reposition your final work or your images within these rectangles. And then you would just export it or, send it to print, whatever you wanted to do with it. But like I say, this is really a job for Affinity Publisher. So let me show you why, because again, people might dismiss Publisher thinking, oh, well, that's for desktop publishing, I don't need it. But even within a photographic context, it's got a lot of uses. So I'll do the same thing. I've got my web preset here. I've got QFHD. That's my 4K preset. And this time I'll use the picture frame rectangle tool located here, and I'll just drag it out. Okay. Now I can do the same thing as I did before. So I can add like a mid-gray fill, and I can add a 6-point stroke for a border. But now, what I can do instead is, I'll just reposition this, is I can drop in those same AF photo files. So let's try a different one. Let's try a tanuki, which is a Japanese raccoon dog. But this time, because it's a picture frame, I can just really easily, change the zoom, reposition this around in the picture frame. And then if I want to move, rescale or reposition the picture frame, it will do that, like so. Okay. So then if I get a second picture frame, drag this out, I can find, say, maybe this butterfly, yeah, and drag it straight in. So that you it just simplifies the workflow. There's no, you don't need to clip layers into the rectangles. You can use the controls just to zoom, reposition, like before. You can do this. You can scale to max fit, like so. There's all kinds of options, basically. And so this is kind of like my my preferred approach for doing this kind of thing. So then I'll drag out a final picture frame like so. And let's see, we want a nice, how about this one? This is lovely. This is all just work that I've done in the past, that I might want to lay out for, submission to a competition or just to showcase my work. Okay, oh, that needs scaling in slightly. And of course, everything snaps as well. So once we've got our 3 picture frames, we can select them all and make sure that they're aligned horizontally and vertically, smack bang in the middle, like so. So that was just a little bit of a brief detour to Affinity Publisher here. Let me see, questions. Okay. So, David, if you know Affinity Photo, what's the learning steepness on Affinity AD? David, I assume you mean Affinity Designer. That's, again, I'm hoping this doesn't turn into too much of a perceptual sales thing, but like one of the great advantages is, again, the unified user interface. So if you learn, we may well refer to them as quirks or foibles of the Affinity software, but if you learn the idiosyncrasies of, say, Affinity Photo, it's really easy to translate this to Affinity Designer as well. I'll just run these apps up, but I think we're still having that Big Sur security check issue, so that might take a few seconds. But yeah, the user interface is common across all three apps. So, you learn Photo, you can easily just translate that knowledge to Designer. For example, View Studio gets you to the functionality that's not shown by default. So within Designer, if you want to start designing to an isometric plane, you can enable the isometric panel and start designing things there. So you can start editing within the plane, turn on the, if you use snapping in Affinity Photo, or even if you use it in Designer, the same snapping principles apply across all three apps. So, I can go in here and enable snap to grid. And then if I'm drawing something out in Affinity Designer, I can draw it out, and have it instantly snap to the plane, like so. The personas, the concept of the personas is the same. You flick across into different workspaces for different tasks. So you can do raster brush work within Affinity Designer, like so. I'm not great at Affinity Designer, don't judge me too harshly, please. So yeah, I would say, if, and this is, I'll be honest, trying to wrap my head around something like InDesign, you just open up, say, InDesign, and you have a small-scale anxiety attack just looking at the user interface. But, coming from, say, a photo background, I found Publisher really intuitive, because a lot of the, the drag drop, the canvas functionality, the shape tools, the pen tool, the way text works, it's all consistent across the three apps. So you can very easily take knowledge from one and apply it to another Affinity app. So yeah, that, again, we're going on a bit of a tangent here. So let me close down Publisher and move back to Affinity Photo, or more specifically, the beta. Okay, so sadly, I think we're more or less coming to an end for this live stream session. But this is actually because David Owensworth, I know you've mentioned luminosity masking quite a few times. My apologies, because every time I see it, I think, oh yeah, I should look into that, and then I inevitably get sidetracked. So yeah, we don't have vast we don't have like luminosity plugin panels or anything like that. And I'll be honest, I don't frequently work with luminosity masking a great deal. One of the areas I did find it quite useful, though, was for astrophotography. Now, for example, if you were using Command-Option-Click to create a selection based on luminance towards the highlight detail, and then invert that, you could do something like add a curves adjustment, and that would help you, it helps just separate some of those background tones from the highlight tones, not by a great deal, unfortunately. So this is where I started to experiment with procedural textures. So for those of you who haven't played with procedural texture, oh boy, this thing is a lot of fun. Essentially, you lay down equation fields for channel data, so red, green, blue, alpha, for example. And then you just type various functions, and you use variables like, capital RGB and A for the channel information, and you can use width, height, X, Y, or RX and RY for user controllable canvas positioning. Probably getting ahead of myself here. So I've been doing things like weighted RGB masking. And in actual fact, I'm going to invert this. So I'll just add a 1 minus in front of my equation here. Okay. And this gives me like a live mask, which I can control. So this is all, this is a preset that I've created. I probably won't try and recreate this live, I don't think I've quite committed it to memory. This is actually, interestingly, these values here, this is the weighted RGB grayscale conversion I was talking about. So you'll see here 0.7152 for green, and that's the most sensitive, and then red 0.2126, and then blue, which is the least sensitive, 0.0722. Okay, that produces us a weighted grayscale conversion or representation here, and then I can use these sliders. Okay, so what I might do now is I'm already targeting the alpha channel. Let's say I want to use this non-destructively as a mask. The way to do that is to put it into a group, specifically as a mask layer or an enclosure layer. So let's say I add a curves adjustment. Let's drag this all the way down here like so. So I want to darken the background, right? What I can do is group this curves adjustment. Then I want to get my procedural texture, and I want to offer it to the thumbnail of the group, like so. Okay, so now, if I go into my procedural texture, I can alter the values here, so the clamping, the threshold, and so on. And actually, this curves adjustment is a little bit too aggressive, so let me just take that back a small amount. Okay, and then go back into my procedural texture, like so. Okay, and I can change the red, green, and blue weighting if I want here. So you'll see that has a very small effect on the trails around the Andromeda Galaxy core here. But this just gives me this fine control over, you know, what exactly the tonal range that my curves adjustment is affecting here. So as I drag the threshold to the left, it's affecting more of the highlight detail until it affects pretty much all of it. Okay, but if I drag it out here, like so, I can find a nice middle point. And now if I hide that group, you can see the before and the after. So that live procedural texture masking is working. It's doing its job. It's basically knocking the background tones down and letting the, you know, the deep sky object tones leap out more in this image. And I think I might, you know, make a macro pack of these at some point, because I think they would be quite useful, you know, just being able to go in and change those settings. Okay, now there's one thing just before I sign off as well. I came up with a different use for this. So if I go in and add my live procedural texture again, I don't know what else to call this, so I've called this a 3D weighting mask. Okay, so this actually uses the elevation rotation input, which basically returns XYZ values. And then you can do various things with these 3 axis values. So let's recreate this, I think. So let's see, I'll just try and roughly remember it. Yeah, okay, right, let's start from scratch. So I will add a procedural texture layer, add my equation field. When I'm actually developing my procedural textures for masking purposes, I like to target red, green, and blue so that I can see the grayscale representation of what I'm doing. And then when I'm finished, I'll turn these off and target alpha instead. So what I want to do is add myself an elevation rotation input. Let's call this 3D weighting. Okay, and that's on the variable A. So now I will do AX, so that's the x-axis on this input, multiplied by R. Okay, so that will get us the red channel information. Then we're doing an additive operation here, so we want A and then Y multiplied by G, and then AZ multiplied by B. Okay, so now as I move this around, you'll see that I can get some interesting effects here. So let me just double check this. I think this is correct. So now I'll add a clamping, and to do that, I'll add just a range input here. Just 0 to 1 will be fine. And I'll use smooth step, SC for a curve, and then 0.1, and then B instead of 1, a maximum value of 1. And then my third input into this function is going to be that calculation there. So now I've got my clamping, okay? So even if I have like a value down here, which is very dark, I can modify my clamping like so. So now let's turn this off, the RGB channels, and make it target the alpha channel instead. So now you can see what kind of effect it might be having on the alpha as I move this around. Okay. So yeah, the drone photograph. So let's do Gaussian blur, drag that up, set the blend mode to overlay, like so, group it, then mask that group with the procedural texture, like so. And now what I can do is drag this around the 3D weighting, the elevation rotation input, and also experiment with the clamping here. So with combination of these two, we're blending the effect out of these darker tones here, but it's still affecting the cloud detail, and that looks quite nice, I think. Yeah, so we get these really, I love having, don't get me wrong, for demonstration purposes, it's always good to have things that are real, there's a really stark difference and everything looks, immediately knockout and wow, look at that difference and so on. But when it comes down to actual editing, I really like having the ability to do these nuanced adjustments like so. Right down here, for example, like how much of the darker cloud detail do I want to be affected by this Gaussian blur, and I can just achieve exactly the look I'm going for. And then the great part is that, at any point, I can just take the opacity of the group down like to 70% if I feel the effect is too strong. So that was just an interesting little look at just a couple of ideas that I've been having lately with procedural texture equations. There's so much you can do with them. I am lobbying to have some more functions added, like a natural log, maybe hyperbolic sine as well, a sin H, I believe, for astrophotography tone stretching. I've approximated it, but it's not quite the same. I'd love to have the native function. But yeah, so that's pretty much going to be an end to my live stream. I've nearly been here for an hour and a half now. I did not intend to go on this long, but thank you everyone for sticking with me. It's been lovely presenting to you all. I'll just see if there are any final questions that I can address. But if not, I will try and get back to you after the live stream when I've got some free time. Beatrice, I don't know Tenerife actually. I can imagine the night sky must be very, very clear. Yes, I'm reasonably lucky where I live. It's not rural, but it's not quite. It's Bortle Class 5, but literally, I think 3 minutes down the road we have a pitwood. I live in an old mining village, and that is Bortle Class 4. So I live pretty much on the border of those two Bortle classes. And apart from some street lighting, I can get some fairly decent results for astrophotography, long exposures, as long as I use a clip-in filter, more or less, yeah. But if I want really clear skies, I'll go out to the pitwood and climb right up to the top, and you can actually see the Orion Nebula core, with just your eyes once they adjust. It's pretty breathtaking, to be honest. I love that stuff. I'm completely into it, basically. When can Affinity Designer fix the app crashing or corrupting whenever the file size reaches 700 megabyte plus? Cloud Strife. I'm afraid I've not come across that issue. Have you tried posting on the support forums, maybe with, if you don't have file hosting ability, what the support team will be able to do is send you a file request link and you can upload the file that's being problematic. Because I regularly work with, gigabyte-sized files and I don't have any issues. And this is in 16-bit as well, both on Windows and Mac. So whether it might be something specific to your configuration or maybe something that you might be doing within your workflow. Not saying it's wrong. I'm saying, if there is something specific that you're doing, it might really help us trying to track that down and help you out. Let's see. More documentation for procedural texture. At some point, yeah. But David, I mean, part of the great thing about procedural texture is a lot of the functions are kind of, they're just wrappers for native C++ or the, Metal or OpenCL bindings now as well. So if you look on things like GitHub, Wolfram Alpha, I'm trying to think of, or, just look at various white papers for image processing. A lot of it is relatively translatable. And then things like Wolfram Alpha will help give you approximations if we don't have native functions. For example, log. To approximate a normalized log transform, you'd use a power function with a very large value for the precision. But yeah, we could go on about this all day, so I'll try not to. I'll try and tail it off here. But yeah, I mean, I just I like to experiment as well. I mean, sorry, I know this is dragging on. We're getting into procedural texture territory now. I'll just sort of casually glance over and see the concurrent viewers drop all the way down now as we're looking at this kind of stuff. But I like to play around. I mean, what have I got here? Oh, absolutely nothing, it would seem. Okay. Let's see, a light pillar that you can move around. Yeah, I mean, even just simple things like this, playing around with various functions. Some of these are not, based around some kind of mathematical background of mine. I was terrible at maths at school. I've since, through programming and so on, I've had to kind of gradually develop it a bit more. Let's see, things like this. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is just playing around. Ooh, the hatching, that's probably going to murder the stream encoder now. But yeah, I'm trying to recreate various filter gallery effects as well. I've had a lot of fun trying to do this sort of thing, like these sort of procedural scratches that you can move up and down, like so. And honestly, some of it is literally just experimentation and trial and error, seeing how, like, say a sine function will affect a cubic noise function, for example, or a harmonic smooth oscillation function, and then taking the various inputs and so on. Like I say, it's just, have fun with it, experiment with it. Wow. Yeah. Maybe not too much fun, otherwise you'll end up with something like that. But yeah. Anyway, I am going to leave it there because I am gasping for some water and probably a snack at this point as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in again. I hope this has been interesting for you. I hope you've learned some interesting ideas or techniques from the editing I've done and that sort of thing. Again, I'm just so grateful that, I've had all this interaction in the chat and that people have come to watch. So thank you very much, everyone. I really, really appreciate it. And I'll leave you with my fancy intermission thing with music. Okay? But take care, everyone. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.